Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new edition of the ERS Monograph podcast. I'm Guido Marchi, pulmonologist at the University Hospital of Pisa, Tuscany, Italy, and I'm joining you today as the member of the ERS Monograph editorial board, serving as the Early Career Member representative. In this episode, we will be discussing the newly published ERS Monograph on Thoracic Ultrasound, the second edition dedicated to this topic and the first in nearly 8 years. It is a comprehensive and timely research that reflects the remarkable progress our field has made in mastering and expanding what ultrasound can do at the bedside. I should also mention that I'm personally honored to have contributed to this monograph as co-author of one of its chapters, which makes this conversation particularly meaningful to me. And today, I'm delighted to welcome two of the three guest editors of this monograph, Professor Christian Laursen, Clinical Professor of Respiratory Medicine at the University of Southern Denmark and Head of Research at the Department of Respiratory Medicine at Odense University Hospital. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Guido. Really looking forward to this discussion.
Great. And Dr. Vineeth George, Staff Specialist in Respiratory and Sleep Medicine and Lead of the Pleural Service at John Hunter Hospital in Newcastle, Australia. Welcome, Vin.
Thank you, Guido. Delighted to be here.
Thank you very much. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the third guest auditor, Professor Najib Rahman, Director of the Oxford Respiratory Trials Unit and Professor of Respiratory Medicine at the University of Oxford, who unfortunately could not be with us today, but his vision and leadership have been integral to shaping this monograph, and we are grateful for his contribution. Well, Christian, Vin, thank you very much for being here. For me, it's a real privilege to have such a range of expertise and experience in this conversation. So, Vin, let's start with the big picture. Looking back over the past 2 decades, what would you consider the key milestones in this journey? And why, in your opinion, is now the right time for a comprehensive ERS monograph on this topic?
So thank you, Guido. Look, it's a great question. As you know, it's been about 50 years since the utility of ultrasound in thoracic disease was probably first established. And the last 20 years has seen substantial change. One of the key milestones there was the recognition that a lot of the pleural procedures in particular that we perform can cause significant harm, particularly visceral and vascular injury. And so we saw a number of patient safety reports, both initially in the UK, but then in a lot of other countries. And what that led to, I think, is ultrasound becoming the standard for procedural intervention in the space. And we've seen large-scale implementation, regardless of where you work, what craft group you're in. People see ultrasound as a tool that guides procedural care. And what that's done is it's provided ultrasound and it's allowed us to develop the use of ultrasound in other areas. And I think the huge change that's followed on from that is the recognition that ultrasound can have an impact on our diagnostic and theranostic armamentarium. So we've seen lots of trials in that area. So that's probably the second big milestone in my view. And that's outside the pleural space, of course. So also looking at respiratory failure, looking at pneumonia, looking at PE, DVT. So the utility of ultrasound is expanding rapidly. And then the third major milestone, I think, is we are now starting to see guidelines take it on and embed it. And that is probably the next step, going from those guidelines to making the ultrasound as widespread and as used as the stethoscope. And I think that's the big challenge for us as a group going forward.
Thank you very much, Vineeth. That's a wonderful starting point and a journey that this monograph, I believe, traces with remarkable clarity from the earliest clinical application to where the field stands today. So moving on to you, Christian. One of the distinctive features of this monograph is the inclusion of a chapter dedicated to the patient perspective. Why is this important to incorporate the patient's voice into thoracic ultrasound practice and education? And in your opinion, what impact can this have on the way we develop and deliver care?
I have to put a disclaimer here because I'm not an expert in research in patient perspective. So this is a more personal opinion. Simultaneously with the ERS monograph, there's also been the procedure of making an ERS statement on ultrasound-guided procedures. And as part of this mixed method study on patients' perspective on ultrasound-guided procedures were also developed. And from my personal experience, one thing is the statement itself, but what provided me with most insight and things that I could change in my everyday practice was actually some of the patient perspectives. And many of these patient perspectives are also included in the chapter in the monograph. And many of these things are quite simple. So if you read the chapter, that could actually have an everyday practice on how you perform thoracic ultrasound tomorrow. And many of these aspects are related to simple bedside manners. And I think most of us as physicians or healthcare staff have an integrated understanding of what good bedside manners is. But if we do thoracic ultrasound or ultrasound guided procedures, there are some aspects that we need to consider in order to be able to give the patient the best possible and safe experience of having these procedures performed. So I think that's really essential as well.
Thank you very much, Christian. That's a really powerful point. I truly believe that every procedure we guide is in service of our patients. And I mean, keeping that at the heart of what we do truly changes everything, in my opinion. So Vin, turning to you now again, thoracic ultrasound, let's say, has transformed the diagnosis and management of pleural diseases, as you were saying, improving both diagnostic accuracy and also procedural safety. What would you consider the most important advances in this field? And what are the remaining unmet needs where further progress is required, in your opinion?
I think ultrasound has really grown in parallel with pleural services and pleural disease as a subspecialty. We've already touched on its role in procedural guidance, but I think the thing that's most exciting for me and what the new monograph really spends some time on is the diagnostic and theranostic aspects. So we've had a number of high impact studies that have really assessed multiple points in the patient's journey. So looking at ultrasound's ability to differentiate transudates and exudates through to predicting response based on diaphragm movement, guiding pleurodesis, and then finally even predicting when patients will represent in the setting of malignancy. And so what we're starting to see is not just its use in procedural safety, but its use well beyond that. In saying that, I think there's a lot of unmet need that is slowly being addressed. But I think what we've done very well is to position ultrasound is a key tool for procedural safety. But I think the second part that we need to do as a group is really deliver ultrasound at scale and get to the point where all of our colleagues that are using a stethoscope are feeling like they can use ultrasound for a broader range of applications.
The progress in pleural medicine over the past decades has been remarkable. And I think the balance between what has been achieved and what remains to be done is something this monograph really captures very well. As you mentioned before, the scope of ultrasound has expanded considerably beyond pleural disease, with application, as you said, ranging from acute respiratory failure, interstitial lung disease, pulmonary embolism, lung tumors, infections, diaphragmatic assessment, focused cardiac ultrasound. In your opinion, which of these expanding applications do you believe will have the greatest impact on everyday respiratory practice in the future?
I think for me, the area that is probably the most interesting and potentially has the most scope to help patients is undifferentiated respiratory failure and undifferentiated breathlessness. You know, we've got a lot of amazing work looking at heart failure, pneumonia, all those disease processes that you touched on. But I think what is really exciting is our ability to take ultrasound to the front door. And Christian and his team have done a lot of the work in this space. What is really exciting is to see lots of different groups, whether it's, pediatric sepsis, whether it's adult pneumonia, whether it's heart failure, groups that are disparate from around the world, all starting to see the role of ultrasound and starting to embed that in guidelines. And I think to me, that is the most exciting thing, that it is becoming really a front door application.
I believe the versatility you described is really one of the defining features of modern thoracic ultrasound. And I believe it's exactly why a research like this monograph that can guide clinicians across all of these applications in a structured and evidence-based way is so needed at this point. And this, brings us naturally to training, Christian. As thoracic ultrasound becomes increasingly accessible worldwide, I would say, I believe that ensuring appropriate training and competency assessment is essential. What are the key elements, in your opinion, of an effective training pathway, and how can we ensure that clinicians acquire and maintain the skills needed for safe and high-quality practice?
I think that's a brilliant question, Guido, and I'm not sure that I'm able to provide the clear answer or solution for this because this is a huge task to solve. I think the ERS, with the gradual development of the ERS Thoracic Ultrasound Training Program, is a really important step to provide evidence-based training and, importantly, also competency assessment. Of course, this is, from my perspective, a brilliant training program since I've been part of developing it, but it definitely also has some limitations. One thing is scalability, because of course it's a limited training program in which not all respiratory physicians in the world can participate, and it also costs money. So we still have this challenge in able to provide scalable training in thoracic ultrasound. Another aspect is, even though if you participate in an evidence-based training program, as a physician, you still have to go home to your own department and continue your training there. So you heavily will rely on local experts, bedside training, mastery learning, and so on. And if you're not in a department where you have this support, you will definitely still face challenges, which can be difficult to solve. Fortunately enough, there's many new also research and new technical applications which can help and support this, so you're not completely on your own, so to speak. Another thing also worth mentioning is that if you look within the ERS and all the educational activities, you can also see that the level of competency and clinical implementation has just increased for every year. So now there's definitely also a need for maintenance and bringing people up to speed on what's going on. And also within the ERS, there's much activities going on for ensuring training and education for the next level of thoracic ultrasound.
I completely agree with you, and I truly believe that the best evidence in the world only makes difference if the clinicians at the bedside have the skills to apply it. And that is exactly what your work in this monograph really helps to address, in my opinion. So, Christian, staying with you, let's say, despite the remarkable progress achieved, several questions, I believe, remain unanswered. What do you see as the most important research priorities for thoracic ultrasound over the coming years? And where do you think the greatest opportunities for innovation lie?
I think some aspects Vin have already touched on. I think there will be a natural process where research will go into more depth, for example, specific diseases like interstitial lung diseases and so on. And the same aspect with ultrasound, much focus has been on using it as a diagnostic tool. But this also means there's a potential for using it as a monitoring tool. And for many diseases, we still do not have research to support that. You're mentioning where the biggest possibilities for innovation lie, maybe also the biggest challenges. From my perspective, there are two major threats, but also potential that may be able to lift the level of thoracic ultrasound even further. Of course, there's the technical development we have seen with handheld ultrasound machines and so on, and now also with artificial intelligence coming. The problem from a research perspective is that the technical and AI development is way faster than generating evidence base. So at one hand, we need to ensure, of course, that we use the new innovative techniques in clinical practice, but at the same time, we also need to ensure that the implementation is evidence-based, so we ensure that we do not harm the patients. And one thing apart from the technical aspects is also, as Vin mentioned, many other specialties have started using thoracic ultrasound as well. And I know in many countries as well, general practitioner, pre-hospital staff, and so on also have started using it. This is a potential advantage for the patients because now your general practitioner might be able to identify pleural effusion very early, which is brilliant. But this is also as the opportunity for the general practitioner to refer the wrong patients, and then we might drown in the hospitals. So we need to support the implementation of thoracic ultrasound elsewhere also to ensure that the patient has optimal pathways when referred and so on.
I really agree with you. Everything is moving very fast, challenging, but really inspiring research agenda, in my opinion. And I believe this monograph will help mapping both the state of the art and also the gaps that remain to be filled in the future. Finally, back to you, Vin. If there is one key message you would like our listeners to take away from this monograph and from today's discussion, what would this be?
From my point of view, ultrasound is now an extension of the physician's arm, and the evidence base is increasingly mature. And I think the onus is on us as a group to put as much time and effort and achieve the same success that Laursen and his colleagues had in making the stethoscope used worldwide. And so I think that's the challenge for our generation.
A perfect note, I would say, on which to close this podcast. Well, thank you all so much for being here today and for sharing your expertise, your experience, and your vision with all our listeners. Thoracic ultrasound has evolved into a cornerstone of modern respiratory practice, and this monograph provides both a reflection on the progress achieved and a guide also for the future development of the field. To our listeners, I will highly encourage you to explore the individual chapters of this monograph and also to take advantage of the ultrasound clips and case example accessible via the QR codes, which bring, in my opinion, the dynamic nature of this examination to life in a way that still images simply cannot. You can find this podcast along with other ERS Monograph podcasts on the ERS Respiratory channel. And we truly look forward to welcoming you to the next episode, which will continue to explore topics of high clinical and scientific relevance. Thank you very much for joining us today.